Yep. That's very strange. However, it's what is. I'll plug this in.
I'm also gonna video a voice record.
Got it covered, eh?
I was so annoyed last week. Okay, all right, that's right. Okay. Just, I think it's got the screen. It's got the screen okay, right? It's got power on.
Maybe I should take the thing over to the residents. I did that once years ago when we had an office on Dalhousie Street in the market. And people were taking so long coming back from having their smoke break. I grabbed the flip chart, hauled it downstairs, set it up on the sidewalk, and I taught where they were standing around. They were so embarrassed.
Dan talked about doing class in the common room.
I need to, oh. Okay. And that's. Oh, no, I'm mixing you up, sorry.
You're good, Marie?
I think so, yes, thank you. Okay. It's rolling, I presume.
No, just in the back. Yeah, both are rolling.
It got me covered. Okay. Let me begin. This is Monday, April 3rd. And we're in IGR. And up to this point, we've covered a number of stages of the story. The historical background to where the government was coming from to explain why it started out where it did. All the history of treaties and the whole practice of using treaties as a legal way to push Indigenous people out of the way, really, from what they wanted to do with the land, whether it was farming or resource extraction, whatever, or mining, anything. So that was the history that the federal government was bringing to the issue in the modern times. Then the big turning point for the modern era of the North was the discovery of oil up in Alaska, and that just opened up a whole explosion of industrial activity coming to the North. Just running over people's land, nobody asking anybody, any local people questions of what they wanted, what they thought of anything. All the decisions were being made down in Ottawa and between the government and the oil industry. And everybody down here thought we were all going to get rich. And didn't quite work out that way. But then in '73, when that big Supreme Court decision was made, that confirmed and surprised the government that people who didn't have treaties still had something called an Aboriginal right to their land. Didn't say what that right gave, what powers went with that, just said you guys have a right to your land that has to be understood and respected. And well, there were two ways of answering the question of what is that right, or what are those rights? They could have either gone back to court and asked a judge to explain it more. But the courts have not been reliable from the government's point of view. They had up to that point, they assumed the courts would be of the same mind as the government, that these things are old fashioned, we don't do that stuff. Well, the courts proved them wrong. So the alternative way of answering the question, what are those rights, is to sit down and negotiate something between the two parties. So that opened the door to land claims negotiations. Government issued a policy, it's guidelines for how it was going to do this stuff, do land claims negotiations. 6 months after that Calder decision in '73, and their first position was a very limited image of what a land claims would ever amount to. About basically 3 items, and the only question to be negotiated was how much land you're going to get, little parts of land for yourselves, what kind of hunting and fishing rights you were going to have, and they were going to give you as if you didn't have them already, and how much money it was going to cost the government to get you to sign the deal. That was the scope of what they envisioned was going to happen in land claims. Well, the next stage, the next 6 years, was a whole process of it. On the Inuit side, they were all young. Nobody had ever done this before, and so they were still figuring out even the language to use to describe what they wanted, as well as imagining all the things that they would want. Because you only got one kick at the can with a treaty or land claim settlement. So they had to think through all the possible things that would have to be, could be included in any land claim agreement. And it took, a number of years for all the conversations to take place. And yeah, good. And so that's what happened in those years, 73 to 79. They tabled one proposed land claims agreement, and in early 76. But then they withdrew it, and they resubmitted something a year later. And you need help or anything? Okay.
Yeah.
Anything I can do?
Huh?
Anything I can do? Okay. And so they tabled another one. That's where they called for and made it really clear. Our top priority is to create a territory where Inuit are in control, a political territory, not a land transaction, but a real a territory with its own government. And so I just want to pick up the next session now is negotiating that deal. Something happened in 1979 and 1980 to break open that roadblock in those last parts of the 1970s, because, as Dan so eloquently put it, well, here's, by the way, here,
Can we go back?
yeah, and negotiating the deal. Okay. I learned something from the conversations we had around the tables on Friday. Just to make sure you know who the people are and how to spell their names. So I'll do that every time. These are the key players that you'll be watching and listening to today. Paul Kwasa, very, very well-known guy, but he first made his name as the chief negotiator for TFN, Tonga Federation in Nunavut, that was negotiating the claim. The other key negotiator was Bobby Catlin from Cohopto, and Paul was from Igloolik. And again, they were all in their late 20s by that point. So they were the main negotiators, and the fellow that they were up against is this guy, Tom Malloy. Hi, come in, please. And Tom Malloy, he was a lawyer appointed by the Liberal government at the time to be the negotiator. So there was a here's a diagram showing what the history was of the negotiations in terms of events. No, that's not it yet. It's the next one. Here's Dan's slide, but here's what the stalemate was all about. There were two issues that neither side could agree on what the other side wanted on two key things. Your leadership said, we're not signing any agreement unless the government agrees to divide the Northwest Territory so that there's a Nunavut territory created, a political territory. Government's response was, as they put it, we note your position, which means, okay, we hear you, but we have no intention of going there. It's not in the cards, not in the government's plan at all. And they were quite intentional about that. They have no plan to let Inuit control the whole territory. On the government side, they said at the outset, we're not signing any deal unless you guys agree to extinguish any claim you have to the land. Any legal claim to the land. And your side responded, we can't do that. That's too offensive to the soul to be asked to give up our rights to the land. So that's why there was a stalemate. Each side put their non-negotiable issue up front and expected the other side to meet them all the way. And neither side would. So they were still kind of dancing. They were kind of like they got onto the dance floor, but they hadn't agreed on what the dance was. And so they weren't really holding each other at that point. And but here's a diagram showing the history of that decade. That represents the 1970s. But something happened in 1979. Your leadership had a big meeting in Igloolik, And they said, we're not getting anywhere here. We're not, things are going nowhere. And at the same time, the government continues to issue exploration permits all at once, wherever it wants. And so they're still feeling the pressure of the expanding oil and gas activity. And they made a decision in that meeting. They made a couple of decisions that allowed negotiations to get going. And so the success of the whole thing was a result of leadership on your side of the table, finding a way to still get what they wanted while getting around those big issues that they couldn't agree on. And essentially, that's one of the main things they did. They said, okay, you want us to extinguish our rights. We want you to create Nunavut. We're not agreeing on to do either of those. Instead of stopping all talks, why don't we agree to put those issues off to the side and see what we can talk about? And then when we've talked about it, when we found agreement on as many things as possible, then we'll go back to those two issues. And then we'll decide if, so they didn't let those issues stop things. So the other main decision they made as a tactic or a strategy, government did not want to talk about creating a political territory which could involve Inuit and non-Inuit in the north, in land claims that were just for Inuit. So your leaders said to the government, we'll take the idea of Nunavut off the out of land claims negotiations. And that must have made the government people feel like the Inuit blinked on it and gave in, but they didn't give in. They said, we'll take it out of land claims. We won't talk about creating Nunavut in our land claims agreement, but be forewarned that, but they said they want to talk about it simultaneously at a different table, a different process, just to get it away from the land claims, so land claim stuff could be negotiated. And when they suggested that, they also said, be forewarned, no matter what we end up agreeing to in a land claims agreement, at the end of the day, we ain't signing it unless the government at that other table ends up agreeing to create the Nunavut territory. And as I said earlier, the government's response to that was, okay, we'll set up a separate table to talk about Nunavut, but no morning. To themselves, they were saying, we still don't expect to create a Nunavut territory. We'll just wait them out. When they see what's agreed upon in the land claims, that'll be enough. And they'll let the whole Nunavut idea go. And but your side said, we're not signing anything unless there's also an agreement to divide the Northwest Territories at the end of it all. So they set up two processes that were going at the same time for the whole decade, And you've done your land claims course already, so then I'll just walk through what was agreed to in that 10 years in the land claims. You know, first, and this is almost in sequence in the general order that they worked that thing. The first and uppermost set of issues had to do with land and resource management. And then they went into financial provisions, a whole bunch of articles there. Then they went into social provisions. Some they got, some they didn't. And finally, they got down to the issue that the government was interested in. When we come out of this, who's going to own the land? Because for Southerners, owning the land it means everything. So your negotiators didn't want to deal with that issue until they got to see how much the government was willing to come across on a variety of other things. That's a basic negotiating strategy. Know what the other side wants and get them to give you as many things as you can get them to give before you deal with what they want. So that went on for 10 straight years. Most of the negotiations were down here, although the land identification, actually selecting lands that you guys are going to own, that took place virtually all up north at the community level. Fascinating stories from that too. And then in 1990, they had finished negotiating everything they could in the land claims agreement. And the day came when they had to go back to those two starting issues. Are you guys going to agree to extinguish your Aboriginal right to that land? In exchange for all the things that are in the agreement? All these things. Are you willing to give up your Aboriginal right for this? How would you vote? Any kind of gut feeling of what? Because people had to wrestle with this. How would you vote? Would you give up your Aboriginal right to that land in order to get what you got in the land claims?
I wouldn't want to extinguish all of my rights to land.
Yeah,
Like I want to try to keep as much as I can.
yeah.
So they talked about the land claims in the community
Oh, yeah.
or in.
Where they talked about this, what land they would want for themselves at a community level, because they knew that land and stuff. And they knew the land that was being negotiated. The government people were from the south, they had no clue about the land. So there's some fun stories that Paul Clausen will tell in this video about how they played the government people. And any other questions? Feel free. How would you vote? Right now, if that was on the table. Okay, we got one answer. Everybody answer. Everybody answer. Give up your Aboriginal right in order to get all the stuff that's inside the agreement? Yeah? Yeah? No? Okay. It was a very heartfelt decision.
What would it look like if we didn't give up land?
You would still have an Aboriginal right to the land, but nobody would know what it meant.
Yeah.
So you would have to go to court to get a judge to agree with you that it meant you owned everything. But the judge could just as easily end up saying, well, it gives you the right to hunt and fish, but doesn't give you the power to stop other people from doing everything they wanted either. You didn't know. So it was an unknown right that sounded like it was everything, but it might not have ended up as everything. So an unknown versus what you can see on print. These are your rights, and they include rights to the land, in one way or another. So you're better off having 300-page documents saying what your rights are, or a card that's face down that nobody knows if it's an ace or a deuce, but it's an Aboriginal right. No, but it's got your face on it though. Who wants to extinguish something with your identity attached to it? So that's the structure of that decade when all the decisions were made. And at the end of the day, they had to come to terms with these two issues: extinguishment and they did. The leadership and they consulted with the community, and there was a significant opposition to it, but they ended up blinking and saying, if there's no other way of getting all of this that we've agreed to, we'll agree to that clause. It's in Article 2 of the Land Claims. And it's anybody have an agreement? Andy? I could read the text. Release and surrender. Article 2 in the Land Claims Agreement, the Nunavut Agreement. And can you look it up, the article, please?
I might have a little downstairs.
Yeah, oh, don't worry, people look it up, research skills. But look up Article 2 in the Land Claims Agreement, please.
Part?
Article 2. Oh, which part? Yep. There's a part that has the language for, they don't use the word extinguishment. But that's okay. Certainty. Can I read this out? This is the clause. Article 2, Part 7. In consideration of the rights and benefits provided to the Inuit by this agreement, Inuit hereby cede, release, and surrender to Her Majesty the Queen in right of Canada all your Aboriginal claims, rights, titles, and interests, if any, in and to lands and waters anywhere within Canada and adjacent offshore areas within the sovereignty or jurisdiction of Canada. That language is very interesting because if you look at the treaties from 1870s, those are exactly the same words. The Indians agreed to cede, release, and surrender. They don't just say give up. They say it a bunch of times, so there's no room for anybody later on to question what it meant. You know, they got you. And he also agreed on their behalf, the Inuit did, and on behalf of their heirs, descendants, and successors, not to assert any cause of action. In other words, never to go to court and to stop a development and say you've got Aboriginal rights to that land, and that gives you the right to stop that. You're handing that card over to the government. What are they going to do with it? They're going to burn it. Because anything that would give you power that's unpredictable, they didn't want that. Industry couldn't function if there was somebody out there lying in the grass or in the tundra, just able to go to court and say they have an Aboriginal right that can interfere with all the development. So there it is, but it's that's the extinguishment clause. And your leadership decided for a variety of reasons that they were gonna get a lot of what they wanted in practical terms. And if the only way to get it was to swallow that clause and they would accept it. And they had a lot of explaining to do to the people in the communities to account for that choice. But then that was the second last thing that had to be agreed to. The last thing was this. Okay, your side had given in on that initial demand that the government had right from the outset. But they'd spent 10 years wringing out all sorts of other stuff out of the government, far beyond anything you'd imagined doing. So the question became right down to the end, is the government willing to divide the Northwest Territories? And we'll listen to the people tell the story about that decision, because it was quite a dramatic moment for everybody. And it was on Parliament Hill. And but let me just walk through a summary of those. Oh, this is just in terms of things that influence the government. The story of the negotiations over those 10 years is a story about bureaucracy. This is where bureaucracy enters into the picture in terms of affecting the process. And that's most of what I want you to be exposed to. This stuff, you know, the contents of the agreement. You know, here's the sections for it, of course, land and resource management. All these articles, all relating to water and land management. And the IPGs, the joint management, NWMB, NPC, Nunavut Planning Commission, NERB, Nunavut Impact Review Board, Nunavut Water Board. That whole concept of, and here was the trade-off, but here was also the way your side worked towards a compromise that could still give them the amount of power that they wanted over these kind of issues. Because in the other agreements in Northern Quebec and in the Western Arctic, in the Nunavut case, for example, they got the right to sit in on boards that would recommend to the government what to do. That was not the same as deciding what would be done. Just we'll tell the government what we think should be done, and after that we got no power. They'll do it or not. Your leaders, and it took 5 years to get the government to agree to share management. They said, and this is what the strategy that came out of the Igloolik meeting in 1979. they said, okay, for the government, it's really important to own the land. That's why the government was in the business of negotiating. They wanted to come out owning the land, or most of it, except for those little parts they're gonna give you guys as a favor. And but for the government's mentality, if they had ownership, that meant they had 100% of the power to do what they wanted on it. That was their goal. But your side came up with an alternative model, which was, we'll let the government own most of the land. But we want to create management boards where we are, Inuit are 50-50 with the government, have an equal say in everything. And it's a decision-making, not just an advisory body. It has authority to make the laws for wildlife management, for water usage, for land use planning, and for reviewing development projects. And Inuit would have an equal say with government. Right. And so that took 5 years to get the government to even wrap its head around the idea of sharing and sharing the power with you folks. And one of the things about bureaucracy, and we'll see this when we hear the federal government's negotiator. One of the, I mean, this is the content. Well, let me just finish going through. Right. Land ownership, a couple of articles relating to land ownership. You've looked at all those. Economic provisions. And again, look at all the ones devoted to making sure if there's any economic activity going on in your territory, you guys are on the inside of it, one way or another. And there's a whole variety of ways, including taxation. And the Nunavut Trust compensation. Then there were social provisions. Some of them did some big things they wanted, they didn't get, but anyway, it's let me yeah, then here's the dynamic that went on, because that's the results. But what it took is what I want you to have a feel for today, because there's 2 levels of negotiating that went on all the time. Distracted. Your negotiators sitting on one side of the table, government negotiators sitting on the other. They're in it together for 10 years, facing each other, getting to know each other, learning about each other. The government folks were teaching your people about how government works behind the scenes. And their negotiators were going up north and learning about Inuit and your world, which they're all Southerners. They had no idea, no experience, no exposure. So wide open education. So over 10 years, one of the reasons why they could reach a deal is because both teams stayed the same in terms of who was involved in it. There wasn't a revolving door on either side. So people built up their history of working together and duking it out at the table often. And there's even one incident where Bobby Cadlin was so pissed off, he got up and walked around and kicked the federal negotiator in the shins. And so it got quite tough stuff. And but the federal negotiators had an interesting role. They were the ones that got exposure to Inuit and what you wanted and learned to understand it. But they couldn't say yes to it themselves. They had to there's all these departments in the government, that's where the bureaucracy comes in, that had a stake in how things were being run in Nunavut, in the Northwest Territory. And so the federal negotiating team had to turn around from you looking at your leaders and go back into the government, take TFN's proposals on anything, and go over to a number of departments and get them to buy into it. And some departments were real hard noses and didn't want to surrender any of their power. And that's why it took 5 years to bring them in and bring them around. And they started with the wildlife agreement. Why? Because that's where your leaders were on it was an issue they understood more than anybody else down here. So, and that was important to them, among other things, of course, but it's, it's, so a lot of what had to be done was the government negotiator negotiating with his own government behind the scenes. He had to get all sorts of departments to agree with what looked like a good possibility. So there's education in all directions, and that's the main reason it took 10 years. But also they were far apart. You'll see this in the video of Tom Malloy. There was a conference here in Ottawa in 2015. I guess it was the 25th anniversary of the agreement in principle being signed in Iqaluit in 1990. And they brought back a lot of the people, great number of them, who had been involved in all steps of the negotiation through those years. And we went down with the students and with our video camera and recorded as much as we can, because it was real historic stuff. And we even set up a special session with Paul Crossa and Tom Malloy, the chief negotiator for TFN and the federal negotiator, and students could ask questions and stuff. So I'm going to show you some clips of that. So just want you to have a feel for the dynamic and the issues. You'll let me cue it up here. Awesome.
When was the call coming?
A couple of weeks from now.
A week?
Yeah. 2 or 3 weeks. Oh. Might as well plug the sound in. What the hell? And I said, I know I've said this before, but when you think of those treaties that First Nations signed 130 years ago, 150 years ago now, wouldn't the young people your age out in the prairies give anything to talk to those people that signed those treaties? What the hell was it like for you? Why did you sign that? Stuff like that. And you guys have these people in your life that did that, and 100 years from now, there's going to be kids wishing they could ever speak to these folks. So they're coming through here. So you're living in a good time, you know, or a privileged time, really, historically, that they're still available to talk to directly and ask questions of them. Because it's something that gonna be lived with forever. Well, here's Paul.
Yes, yeah, it did take a lot of our energy, a lot of time, because when we're negotiating at times, it's very frustrating. You know, we get mad at each other, you know, it's a good thing we never got physical, but very close to that. So in my study, I was at times we couldn't stand the federal negotiating team. We had to walk up. So very emotional at times, especially when the federal government couldn't understand why we wanted so much. And we knew that this is what is needed in Midland. And at times it's very, very frustrating. I mean, you know, unfortunately, our chief negotiator, Bob Cutler, was our chief negotiator for many years. And, you know, it's like, there's been a few of our negotiators that have passed away. So all these emotional things did take place, and, you know, even our chief negotiator took it so hard that, fortunately at that time, by committing suicide. So this is how hard it was negotiating. So not Jordan. And then at the end, during the ratification process, it was also frustrating trying to get the EU to understand what the package contained. I mean, I used to be called communist, dictator, Saddam Hussein, anything, you know, so, but that's how hard it was. But at the end of the day, I got a good, very good support. The reason why we gave the 3 days to ratify the land rights agreement was because we had a I think it was 69% of your population had to vote yes. So we made sure it wasn't just a 1 day vote. We made sure it was 3 days to ensure that we got as many emails. Ratified.
I was gonna ask you, about just the name. And so it's been more, a little bit further about going to the committees and having to share what it was for the city council in this agreement and help people understand that and what were some of the challenges or.
As I said earlier, we had to invent new terminologies because a lot of the things in here were very new to the unit. We had to try and explain what it really is, because a lot of these are sort of common concept of what an agreement is rather than Inuit concept. So that was the hardest part, especially as I was saying earlier, what is ownership? How do you own the land that you always lived on? You know, so that was one of the things. And of course, the extinguishment clause. That was one of the hardest things to explain, what it really meant. And it was again very emotional for a lot of you, especially when they finally understood what the extinguishment clause was. But on the other hand, you see that in any other vaccines. Around our time when we negotiated, it's everybody had to extinguish a certain way to get something in return. But you know, deep in our hearts, we said, this is going to be the hardest part, explaining the extinguishment, because no other Canadian ever had to extinguish any rights. It was the Inuit that had to extinguish them. And that's one of the things we tried to explain to the federal government. Look, no other Canadian ever extinguished any rights as Canadians. And here we have to do it. But on the other hand, we like the tuna, which is the land grants and creation of it. Yeah.
Oh, I've heard stories about the negotiations around land selection. Which lands were going to become Inuit-owned lands and the communities were involved. I've heard stories that those were quite fractious negotiations at times. Could you tell some stories about how that was done and what the difficulties were and where the government was coming from and what you guys fought over once in a while?
Certainly. We found that a lot of areas like we had outlined Quant, which was the first part, an agreement on Quant, how big the land in total area that's going to get. But then we had to break that up into parcels of land. And we got the need to select certain parcels of land. A lot of times we ended up having small parcels of land. But one of the other things that we found out is that the federal government forever and they always wanted access. They needed a corridor. So you know, which divided that parcel of land that we selected. They needed a corridor here to go from point A to point B. They don't, so they don't have to go through this entry and access provision. Online says how one can have access to new land, so they had to build corridors. But the fun part, of course, was the Inuit exactly knew those lands that we had selected inside of where the federal government didn't. You know, they just saw actual land identified. But we need a corridor where, for the Inuit, knowing that parcel of land inside and out, decided we meet together. Okay, which is the hardest part to have access over, which is the baddest lands that you can think of. And sure enough, the Inuits pointed out, okay, this is not a very good access. You go give it to the federal government didn't know that. So that was that's how we did it. The other one, of course, was we wanted to tie around the federal government. So we selected a springtime to start negotiating the union. And it's 24-hour daylight. It's 24-hour daylight, but the so they hired them out. We used to get parts of land that we probably wouldn't have gotten if we had negotiated, but we made sure we negotiated the land negotiations in the north rather than down here. Most of the negotiations took place either in Ottawa or Edmonton, in major centers down south, that the technical ones, but we made sure that land selection took place in Nunavut.
I should mention the first couple of years of the program, we were training field workers to work on that land selection process. And so they were involved in it. Here's the description of the process by the federal negotiator, Tom Malloy. This is from that conference that we had.
You know, looking back on,
One of the things to watch and listen for is, you know, once they decided at the beginning to take extinguishment and the creation of Nunavut off the table in order to get onto other topics they could talk about. The first thing that they discovered was they were miles apart on a whole bunch of other topics too. It wasn't just that one, and that they had to slog through every one of them and bringing in bureaucrats from different departments to agree and stuff. So watch this, or catch this presentation. It's pretty clear.
those early days of negotiations, one wonders how we ever got to the successful end that we did. The issue of Nunavut was non-negotiable. The Inuit wanted management boards that had decision making. They wanted offshore rights. They wanted resource. To find solutions to Nunavut. We found solutions to the offshore. Found solutions.
Sorry, I looked that up.
Relatively constant throughout the entire negotiations.
Sorry about that.
Negotiations, one wonders how we ever got to the successful end that we did. The issue of Nunavut was non-negotiable. The Inuit wanted management boards that had decision making. They wanted offshore rights. They wanted resource revenue sharing. They wanted a land bottom that was nowhere near, but Canada was considering. And there was the cash component. Those were just a few of the issues where we were miles apart. As the minister said, there were something like 42 chapters, and we were equally far apart on all of those. So how do you conduct negotiations, and how do you keep parties at the table talking when you're so far apart? On the Nunavut issue, Dennis made reference to the fact that we got over that by calling the settlement area Nunavut, which was acceptable to everyone. But then we ran into a problem because there needed to be a definition for the territorial government. Because it was a party to the agreement. And it's had to somehow be defined. The solution was to say the territorial government means the territorial government having jurisdiction over the settlement area. So that little compromise got us going. But the other issues, as I say, they remained far apart, difficult negotiations, but the government and the Inuit stayed at the table, continued to talk, to have discussions, to have workshops. We went out and when we were in the north for negotiating, we would go out onto the land, and get take us out and show us the different traditions and historic places that existed, and kept us building up a relationship of trust, helping us understand their culture, and we were helping them understand the culture of government and how government works, and how they have to face the reality of our world as much as we had to face the reality of their world. And so over many years, we stayed at the table, we sought solutions, we had the support of various ministers, we had the support of Deputy Rick and the senior civil servant within the Federal Department of Indian and Northern Affairs. And we also spent a considerable amount of time working with all the other government departments and agencies within the federal government to find solutions to the impossible solutions that we were, or situations that we were facing at the table. We also had to have patience, both sides had to have patience to allow the process to unfold and to take place the way in which in finding solutions. So over time, we were able to find solutions that allowed us to come to the agreement that ended up being the Nunavut Land Claim Agreement. And one of the other things that I think the minister alluded to it was the teams that all of the parties brought to the table. We were extremely fortunate in that the teams remained relatively constant throughout the entire negotiations. That was very important because we had developed the trust and the understanding and the patience that I spoke about earlier, and that continued. And as a result of that, we had some very, very difficult sessions. But when we left the room, what was said in the room stayed in the room, and we could have a relationship beyond the negotiating table. And as a result of that, I think it helped us build confidence that we could find solutions through the work and with the support of the government. I think that we were able to find solutions to Nunavut, we found solutions to the offshore, found solutions to the decision-making for management boards in a way that's acceptable to the Inuit. So all of these issues that were insurmountable at the beginning, we were able to, in the end, find solutions as a result of the dedication of the Inuit and of the government, the people from the government, who worked so hard to bring the agreement to a conclusion. I just want to tell one last story, and it relates to the issue of the decision around Nunavut. You saw the pictures. That meeting went into the early hours of the morning, and you saw how many officials there were. There were constitutional advisors, there were legal advisors, there were people from the department, there was the minister's office. Rick Van Woo was like a room almost like this, with advisors for the few of us that would go into the negotiation. The final issue was Nunavut. And there we sat in the wee hours of the morning in absolute silence. It's almost like day, except I'm speaking. Finally, Rick got up and he said, is there anyone in this room who doesn't believe that at some time Nunavut will be a reality. That was the answer. Finally, almost like a great B movie, turned to the minister and said, Minister, why don't you go for it? I said and agreed. We went back into the room and the deal was sealed. And I remember walking out of the room beside Rick and the minister, and Rick said, Minister, when you get home this morning, I think the first thing you should do is phone the prime minister and tell him what you did to me. And the rest is history. Thank you.
So that's what it looked like from the other side of the table. That meeting, there's a different version of this story. I'll just play it up. It's from the NTI. It's Tagak talking about it. Very dramatic moment.
Akagut 20 ukatano inuit ukaksemayut atilew nangin nakaktuti ang katigi utimi nadliw kumakakti daw niyang ipata nuna bumme. Kanadaw government kungin ang ikatak ako marang itut nutami nuna taang nangming. Kisiani 11 gadak tangani ikakami amma sakitaw niya diglugo nunabud nuna taagayaw runi.
Nursery Article 4, Dalmatam Nursery, Atiliawan, Simangiman, Tagbo, Tagba, Kinulapa, Suldarilasuta, Atiliaptina Suldaristigut, Taimaila, Ukakauma, 11th hour, Munaratoso, Kinulapa, Dariani.
Prime Minister Mulroney lo issue election kama 1993 milko nirwaxina raxulu taqim maqasiksin anigiyani
Tanna ang katiyong kaistimito awasiw. Tay kuninga niwakar mga yun maana ururatu gramoratu tay kunwa sangalatu.
And there was a big meeting on Parliament Hill. It went on well into the night, past midnight. TFN brought all the heavy hitters back together, all the negotiators.
And then at this famous meeting, the Inuit said, we need your commitment to create a government in our homeland alongside the land claim.
And federal government proposed that we will review this again, idea about dividing that territory in 7 years' time. And we said, no way, that's garbage. Ini wakati katatan so easy to do. Na malita.
Ani sigalo amata uspi mayatini mayangata amisona sama minister good sitting amal kamulo tako oka tene lui pilakapsiolo okalila sama utia aningi kalawati kigun nakotu.
And we pick up the check. I don't know it. Utila, someone translated. Don't do that. Come back. Tukuyakuru in Mari. No coffee. Piani Maktawa Dolan. Utok, taking for Maroon at 3 o'clock in the morning. Maroon wanted to leg it down.
Inyulo yung kakot ang iyong pangat o kaya sumayo tan ay badutayo ang iyong nakta. Kasi mga katigi utayo ilo nila matay kanya katigi utayo nila utayo ade ka po upin nila sa mga iyo.
Pia sa 1970s wanted to be 1992 93 PIs also naman I would surgery says how are you? I have to detail my picture of some you.
A lot of people in that room would have given up a lot of their life, their adult life, to working towards a completion of this whole thing. You just imagine the emotion that people must have felt at that moment.
Johnny, you were with that good. If you could tell me what they lost, I'm Namanatiro.
I'm Tagak. It's a great pleasure for me to bring some very happy news to Canada.
I'm not sure if we would have had another opportunity where all the forces came together.
Arising out of important discussions which occurred over the past 3 or 4 days here in Ottawa.
All this happened very quickly in Parliament in the dying days of the Mulroney government.
So this agreement will honor a relationship and in the form of a treaty, establish the certainty over title of lands and resources in the territory to be known as Nunavut.
The Inuit were great lobbyists. They got the support of the NDP and Liberals as well. So it went through with all party consent.
The Inuit of Nunavut have always insisted that if we're going to sign a land claims agreement, Nunavut has to be included. And that was the bottom line. And I think we've achieved that bottom line.
I think the most important point that we can have a partnership arrangement with Canada. We're not attempting to separate whatsoever.
And it was the last act of the Mulroney government before they were defeated and went down to 2 seats in the Parliament after the 93 election.
I just want to once again congratulate Louis Filicopsi and all of the members of his board from the various regions of Nunavut, and to wish them well as we move toward the conclusion of this historic agreement. Well done.
So that's why you have your territory. And those are the people who did it. And that's what it took. And that last night, they were going to walk away with nothing if the government didn't concede that commitment, make that commitment to create the territory. They were going to walk away with everything that had been negotiated without it. And the government believed them because it was true. That's how committed they were to that final piece of the puzzle. So I just feel like congratulating you all. And but that's what it took, and right down to the wire. And they didn't blink. They didn't blink.
All right, actually, question.
Yeah.
So Mulroney, I know Mulroney signed this before he was outgoing. If the Conservatives didn't sign it, do you think the next government would have?
Yeah, and Mulroney knew that. And the argument they made to him at the last minute was, let the next government get the glory. Signing the biggest land claim in Canada history. Politicians love their names being attached to big things. And so this was something Mulroney got to do just on his way out the door. Because his government was defeated, went from a majority down to 2 people at the next election. So he knew he was on his way out.
It sounds like a jackpot.
Yeah, so that's what those people gave their lives to, that whole process. Can't you imagine how it would have felt, when they got government to sign it off? And didn't get everything, but they got the big ones. They got the big things. And they were hoping, and it wasn't wrong to hope. They took away the power of owning the land from the government. The government ends up owning 82% of the territory, but it only has power over half of that at any one time. And so even though the government owns it, you have half the say in everything that goes on their land as well as your own land. And that was the trade-off. Essentially, they were saying they decided amongst themselves that having the chance to co-manage was just as good as owning. And they didn't need to own it if they could co-manage. And those boards had decision-making power. They weren't just advisory boards. They make the law for what happens. And Anyway, any reactions? Anything you wanna say in response or talk about? Good, bad? Happy, sad?
You were talking about bureaucracy.
Yeah, yeah.
Really, and I don't fully understand that.
I'm just gonna shut this off so it doesn't distract. Yeah, it's because the federal negotiator had to get the consent of people in a whole bunch of different departments, fisheries and oceans, energy, mines and resources, all the departments that were involved up in the Arctic, because they all had some power over something. And they had to sell the idea of Inuit having an equal share of power on every front. And it was bureaucrats. Bureaucrats can make things go fast or slow. You know, and some was it Canadian Wildlife Service held out the longest because they managed. They at that point they had authority over bird sanctuaries and conservation areas, and they didn't want to give it up. So they had to. That was an internal government thing. Bureaucrats could sort of make things go fast, or they could make things go slow, and they had to deal with that on a whole bunch of places, bunch of departments. Any thoughts? No thoughts.
I like how we're talking about that they did it in spring, something with pirate.
Yeah. And then after negotiations, they would often go and play baseball.
Together?
You know, one side versus the other, and they just play ball, because they were traveling together all the time, you know, this cadre, this cohort of, you know, half a dozen or so government people and half a dozen negotiators. And, but when they were choosing the land, it was local people that were saying what land they wanted in their area. And there were times when your side walked out. And because the government would backtrack on its commitments about how they were what they were willing to negotiate. And they think they have a deal, and the government would show up and say, no, we're not doing that. And so.
Was he a politician or a bureaucrat?
He was a lawyer,
Lawyer?
labor lawyer, but he was a liberal, and it was a liberal government in Saskatchewan that recommended it, so. And he ended up negotiating treaties. I don't know if he negotiated the one with the Niska. I don't know if he did or not, but he's negotiated other ones in the West since. So that became his thing.
Kind of the idea they brought in that they had the same lawyer that negotiated the treaties. They're trying to use the treaties for the land. But it didn't work.
Well, is there anybody here that's not on that board? We divided the group into groups of 3 last class, and to work together, because it deals with the 3 different stages so far, and actually we can add this one now. Historical background, getting the government to listen, arguing over the agenda, and now negotiating the deal is the next one. And we need 3 people at least in there. But what that's about, we need better marker pens for one thing. And want you to get together and work in teams of 3 and figure out your piece of the story, what you're going to say when you're in front of the Haida about that piece of the story. So just make good use of your notes, and you'll find out if they're good enough for starters, and that's important to find out. Do they give you what you need to be able to tell other people about that part of the overall story? So if you're not up there now, get your name up and yeah, make the next category. Might as well do the number of the categories. 1, 2, 3, and then have
Erase and start over.
No, don't erase. I want to keep the number of the names here. And so anyway, what time is it?
10:38.
Okay. Well, let's break till 11, but don't be late when you get back here, okay? That's frustrating. And be respectful of what's being asked. So let's get back at 11, and then you go into your small groups, but come back in here first and make sure you found your partner.
Were you on here? No.
Can I just shut the Zoom off or do we have to record it? Yeah, I know.
Hospital, don't